his wife, and some of the songs actually allude to that. And so he then became this feminist, and when they finally had their child, Sean, he stayed home and looked after Sean. And anyway, they had this big concert, and John was on the guitar, and Yoko was singing the songs. And then we had a follow-up conference at their apartment building, and John was, they'd only just moved in, and John was sort of sitting on a carpet not on a carpet, on a mattress playing the guitar, and we were all meeting next door, and I just kick myself to this day that I don't have a photo, though I do have a photo of Yoko at the conference.
What was she like as a person, Sue? She's obviously she seemed to be very idiosyncratic in her public profile.
Well, she was utterly demonised as a witch.
Yes.
She was the woman that broke up the Beatles and so on and so forth. Look, she was a fascinating, interesting, rather shy woman, very, very thoughtful and interesting, and utterly demonised in the media.
That is amazing. Sue's thoughts on John and Yoko there. That'll be online if you want to hear it back, but... What memories that is. On a final note, the Maltese Culture Minister has backed down after trying to take away a gift presented to Prince George from Sir David Attenborough. The natural history icon presented the young prince with a tooth from an extinct megalodon as part of the launch of his latest doco. He also told the story of how he found the fossil while on holiday on the Mediterranean island during the 1960s. As soon as the heartwarming story was made public, the Maltese Culture Minister pounced, saying the tooth should be returned to the island and put in a local museum. And the internet's forced his back down. What do you think? Has the world gone a bit mad about these things, Mike? There are legitimate cases to argue for artefacts to be returned, right? But this seems a bit petty, don't you think? What do you reckon?
Yeah, no, I think we have to be a bit careful with glass houses and throwing stones. In the Māori world, we've demanded the return of various taonga. So, I mean, if somebody thinks that they believes that is something they should have, it's something that is important to their culture and country, I'd be a little hesitant to say it's ridiculous. Although I see the storm sort of blowing out, and he's rescinded his demand. So it sounds like the prince will have his tooth.
Yeah, what do you think, Sue?
Well, Sir David Attenborough is a hero of mine, and as far as I'm concerned, he can do no wrong. So if he thought that he could give that tooth to Prince, whichever one it was, that's fine by me. But I would like to see the Elgin marbles returned to Greece, and more of our artefacts returned to New Zealand.
So repatriation is a thing that you support, even though that artefact might have been there for hundreds of years and might be safer where it is right now.
Yeah, well, it's just that if it was David Attenborough, it must have been fine.
Mike?
They're still upset about their Maltese falcon, I think, aren't they?
Yeah. Have you seen the Elgin marbles, either of you?
Yes, absolutely, in the one of those British museums.
I think it is the British Museum, isn't it?
Yeah,
And
no, absolutely.
Cleopatra's Needle.
And I've seen where they should be in the Acropolis too.
Where they should be. All right, Sue Keshley, Mike Rehu, thank you very, very much for being with us on a Thursday afternoon show. It's been a pleasure. I'm Wallace Chapman. Checkpoint next. See you tomorrow, 3:45 till then.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. Haere nei, Judith Collins wants the warehouse to pay back millions in wage subsidies, but economists say it's an issue for companies and their conscience. 12 cases of COVID-19 in managed isolation today, the biggest number in a month, and 10 of them from the same flight from India. Health Minister Chris Hipkins fires a warning shot at the indebted Canterbury DHB after new documents squarely blame management for the mega deficit. A 4-year parliamentary term gets the thumbs up from two party leaders, but what do voters think? Things get nutty on the campaign trail. Labour's promising to price check groceries and building supplies, and stand by for more on the All Blacks Christmas quarantine saga. Don't forget, you can catch us live on Facebook.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata tēnei. The Labour Party is promising to call the Commerce Commission in to check the price of groceries and building supplies is fair. Party leader Jacinda Ardern says New Zealand has one of the most concentrated grocery chains in the world and this must be scrutinised. Ms Ardern says Labour will conduct market studies for supermarkets and building supplies to check consumers are getting fair prices. She says concerns, particularly over the cost of groceries, have been raised in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
We did see, for instance, during COVID recently, when we opened up the opportunity for New Zealand to raise questions over potentially unfair pricing, we saw a lot of feedback at that time. That raised for us the question of whether we should look at our market as a whole.
Labour Party leader Jacinda Ardern. Health officials say there is no cause for concern about the spike of the number of COVID-19 cases recorded today. There were 12 cases in managed isolation today, but no new community cases for the fifth day in a row. Hamish Cardwell has more.
10 of the new cases were on the same flight from India on September the 26th, where more than 6 million COVID cases have been reported. Otago University epidemiologist Michael Baker says the government should consider additional control measures, such as pre-departure quarantine and testing, from countries like India with lots of reported cases. The Director of Public Health, Dr Caroline McElnay, says while a dozen cases sounds like a lot, the border control system is designed to handle it. Ko Hamish Cardwell, tēnei.
Nationals leader Judith Collins admits comments made during last night's leaders' debate about the wage subsidy were made on the hoof. The subsidy was available to businesses which faced financial difficulty during lockdown and the ongoing impact of COVID-19. Last night, Ms Collins said a national government may look at changing the rules around who could receive the subsidy after reports of businesses claiming the money who didn't need it.
I thought, well, it's not fair actually. I thought about it and I thought it's just not fair for people to have to, wage and salary earners, to have to go and pay more taxes for longer because of people actually, frankly, rorting a system. And so we need to find a way of dealing with that.
Judith Collins says that it's good that some businesses have paid the subsidy back. A media personality and an accountant have been cleared of charges of money laundering for the Comancheros gang due to insufficient evidence. The accountant, Wiwini Hakaraia, will pay a fine for 2 charges of possessing a Class A drug instead. It comes 3.5 weeks into the trial of 5 people, including the gang's local chapter president at the High Court in Auckland. At his sentencing, Hakaraia's lawyer claimed he'd stopped using drugs and proven good character working with anti-smoking and youth mentoring groups. Justice Graham Lang said a $2,000 fine was appropriate. The US Commission on Presidential Debates says it'll announce new measures to ensure the remaining 2 debates between Donald Trump and Joe Biden are more orderly. But as the BBC's Peter Bowes explains, the solution may not be straightforward.
It's a huge problem. The organisation that puts on the debates has said that it will look at the rules, it'll look at changing things so that it doesn't descend into the chaos and the animosity that we saw last night. But it might involve cutting the microphones of the 2 candidates if they are interrupting perhaps too much. But that is fraught with problems. Who makes that decision? Is it the moderator? Is it the director? And how is it imposed? And it could well lead to President Trump or even Joe Biden saying or complaining that they were being silenced.
Peter Bowes reporting. It's coming up to 4 minutes past 5. Uncapped Canterbury lock Mitchell Dunshea has been called into the All Blacks as a replacement for Quinton Strange, who has been ruled out with an ankle injury. Strange is expected to be unavailable for up to 8 weeks, which would see him miss the Rugby Championship in Australia. Dunshea will join the team in Wellington ahead of the first Bledisloe Cup test. Meanwhile, the chances of a Pacifica team joining Super Rugby Aotearoa next season appear to be dwindling, with New Zealand Rugby reportedly opting not to add a 6th team to the competition until 2022. The Warriors have defended their decision to set up a feeder club in Australia, despite criticism it'll affect the future of young rugby league players in New Zealand. The cancellation of national age group tournaments this year due to COVID-19 has left many young players with no pathway for them to impress NRL talent scouts and has left some families considering moving across the Tasman. Warriors CEO Cameron George says clubs the 3-year deal with the Redcliffe Dolphins in Queensland will ensure a sustainable future.
You know, we would lose a lot of players if we didn't have that partnership in place, because as it stands now, we don't have the revenue from this year to be able to sustain 3 teams in a competition in Australia.
Cameron George, the Warriors chief executive. The Los Angeles Lakers have beaten the Miami Heat 116-98 in Game 1 of the NBA Finals. That's the news.
An extra 50,000 New Zealanders have gone on the job seeker benefit this year as a result of the response to COVID-19 and its effects on the economy. So what are the political parties' solutions, and what role do they think the welfare state should play as the country recovers? We find out on Morning Report's social policy debate this Friday morning after the 8 o'clock news.
Now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland and Waikato, fine weather but isolated showers tonight, clearing tomorrow evening. Coromandel, Bay of Plenty, Taupo, Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, cloudy periods, isolated showers in the Bay of Plenty and about the ranges elsewhere. Waitomo to Manawatu, including Taumaranui, Taihape, Wairarapa, Nelson and Marlborough, fine weather apart from a few areas of cloud this evening and again tomorrow. Horowhenua to Wellington, fine today, cloudy periods tomorrow with patchy drizzle. Bulla to Fiordland and Stewart Island, cloud increasing, showers developing south of Hokitika tonight, spreading everywhere tomorrow, then turning to rain from the south with heavy falls possible. For Canterbury, Otago and Southland, excluding Stewart Island, mostly fine today, high cloud developing tomorrow with a few spots of rain in Otago and Southland. Gale nor'westerlies in exposed places tomorrow. Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. RNZ National, it's almost 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. Welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. Now, we understand New Zealand Rugby Chairman Brent Impey is planning to hold a Zoom press conference this evening. We'll bring you more on that as soon as we have further details. But first, Labour leader Jacinda Ardern used a peanut butter factory in Nelson today to announce her party's policy on the cost of living. It's where the party announced its fiscal plan and how it wants to ensure groceries and building supplies are affordable. But the National Party is already picking fiscal holes. Political reporter Charlie Drever and videographer Sam Rillstone were there and filed this report.
There wasn't much social distancing in central Nelson today. Jacinda Ardern mobbed for selfies and only too willing to comply. One woman rushing out of the hairdressers with her hair still in foils so she could grab a snap. But it wasn't all smiles, factory tours and selfies today, with Labour getting down to business and announcing market studies of both groceries and building supplies.
We did see, for instance, during COVID recently, when we opened up the opportunity for New Zealand to raise questions over potentially unfair pricing, we saw a lot of feedback at that time. That raised for us the question of whether we should look at our market as a whole.
Finance spokesperson Grant Robertson also unveiled Labour's fiscal plan for the next term. It is mostly unchanged from Treasury pre-election economic and fiscal update, with the main difference being the inclusion of a new income tax rate for the top 2% of earners, something already announced by the party. $12.1 billion will remain in the COVID fund in case of another global resurgence or an alert level change. But National's finance spokesperson Paul Goldsmith says the plan lacks substance.
Well, this is not a fiscal plan that's been released by Labour today. It's a pamphlet. It has no real detail at all on major spending promises that they've made. For example, they've talked about light rail down Dominion Road, a very expensive pumped hydro scheme. There's no indication in their pamphlet as to how that will be funded.
Paul Goldsmith also pointed to a $140 billion typo in the pamphlet after Mr Robertson spent days poking holes in National's plans.
You would have thought Grant Robertson has spent the last 10 days jumping up and down about figures, and he still managed to get his own wrong.
But Grant Robertson laughed it off.
We have a typographical error in the axis of a graph. Our numbers add up.
And then he hit back at the National Party.
I believe we put forward a balanced plan. It's one that enables us to keep providing health and education services at the same time as keeping control on debt. What National have put up is a plan that's both irresponsible and unaffordable.
But today's unfortunate typo showing both parties are susceptible to errors in rushing their policies out the door to the waiting public, a public that, at least in Nelson, didn't seem to be too concerned. From Nelson, for Charlie Drever, DNA.
Fresh from a rousing review of her debate performance last night, Judith Collins headed north today to a kiwi fruit grower in a bid to prune back Labour's still comfortable lead over the Nats. And crucial for growth is water. Ms Collins unveiling today a new long-term strategy for water management. National also announced $300 million for a dry dock in Whangarei, paid for by private investment and the infrastructure bank the party intends to create. Our political editor Jane Patterson was there and filed this report.
So look at these beautiful plants just coming into...
Oh, look at this, in
bud.
bud. Oh, isn't that sweet?
Just terrific.
Just like a nice budding MP.
The first order of business was to inspect young kiwi fruit vines in a kiri orchard that had been a dairy farm in its former life.
Is this the female here? She's really the most valuable one, don't you think?
Someone that needs to be pruned.
Yeah, somebody probably does need to be pruned.
Second order of business was to rein in her MP David Bennett after he called his colleague Northland MP Matt King a drip among all the talk of irrigation systems.
I've seen a few drips.
Yeah, I wasn't pointing to Matt.
Don't you say that, Matty King.
Hurt my feelings.
So
yeah, very sensitive.
The drip line is going for, Ellen, you were telling me, what, 3 hours a day?
Yeah, 3 hours a day.
Yeah.
But the main business of the day was to reveal a $600 million plan for long-term water storage to be managed under the party's proposed new National Infrastructure Bank.
We are going to be developing a national policy statement on water storage to provide certainty around the strategic use of water, streamlined consenting and minimum environmental standards for newly irrigated land. We will guarantee common ownership of water to all New Zealanders.
But there'd be no concessions for Māori as the long-running debate over ownership continues.
No, water comes from the sky, water belongs to everybody. It is very important that where we have undertaken treaty settlements around things like river, let's say for instance the Waikato River, but also Lake Taupo, that we make sure that we honour those. But I can tell you this, water comes from the sky, and under us, yes, we'll work with iwi.
Also admitting a policy trying to get money back out of big businesses who may have taken advantage of the massive wage subsidy scheme was made up on the fly in last night's debate.
You know, I thought, well, it's not fair actually. I thought about it and I thought it's just not fair for people to have to wage and salary earners to have to go and pay more taxes for longer because of people actually, frankly, rorting a system.
Then it was on to the economic plans of the two major parties, with Ms Collins being asked if National would raid the rest of the COVID fund if its budget became too stretched.
I think people need to understand this, is that what has been termed the COVID fund, given that label by the current government, is simply borrowed money. There's nothing special about it other than that my son's generation and his children will have to pay it back.
So you're saying it's up to any spending under National and not necessarily for COVID response?
Well, actually, under us, we wouldn't be letting COVID run riot in the country.
Labor released a fiscal plan of its own today, complete with typo, with this initial assessment from Ms Collins.
I have been told that they've got a pamphlet out that's 7 pages and half of it's pictures, so I'd call it the children's pamphlet.
$140 billion.
Oh, did they really? 140?
Some sympathy for that?
I would just say always be careful when you throw stones on that stuff. It might come back.
Are you going to have a good read of it and see how well it stacks up compared to the
I'm sure
national
it will take me about 3 minutes if it's the children's version.
Well done for last night.
Oh, well, I enjoyed it. Did you like it?
Enjoyed it.
Oh, God.
Because I'm one of those undecided ones.
Oh, right. Hello.
So.
I don't think there's. I don't think there are many undecided in that audience. I can tell you that. That was fun.
You're looking lovely.
Thank you very much, Ross.
I loved your quip last night.
Which one?
Well, about Mr. Twyford.
Oh, my friend Phil. Yeah. Well, I don't understand understand how he got promotion.
But it was last night's debate people were keen to talk to her about, and she again was keen to talk about gracing Vogue magazine after one of his staff mocked up a front cover, featuring, of course, Ms Collins.
That was one of the staffers, and I thought that staffer needs promotion straight away. I just thought very career enhancing for said staffer, I tell you what.
Judith Collins has given ACT leader David Seymour a glowing endorsement as a potential Deputy Prime Minister and his party ACT as a potential partner. But could she rule out working with Billy Te Kahika and Advance New Zealand, who are campaigning hard up in the north?
Absolutely.
Why is that? Why are you so firm on it?
Because I'm not insane.
What about
In Whangarei for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
Business New Zealand says National's plan to change legislation to allow for wage subsidy clawbacks is wrong and misguided. Subsidy payouts have topped $14 billion while they've kept many New Zealanders in work. They've also helped boost companies who have gone on to record large profits. Now Judith Collins is vowing to get that money back. Just how that would work is unclear, given the companies followed the rules, and business leaders seem sceptical of whether it's even possible. Nita Blake-Person reports.
Some of the country's biggest companies were among the first to claim wage subsidies for their staff. The warehouse took $51 million after experiencing a 30% drop in revenue at the time, but has since announced plans to lay off hundreds of staff.
It was a moral issue. Some of these companies followed the rules, they just didn't follow the spirit of fairness.
Speaking at last night's News Hub debate, both Labour's Jacinda Ardern and National's Judith Collins slammed the behaviour. Judith Collins went one step further, telling moderator Patrick Gower the subsidy rules were too lax and she would make sure companies who didn't need the cash paid it back.
You might have to change a law or something.
Well, we may have to change a law. I would have thought we would have had a lot of support in Parliament to do that.
Jacinda Ardern seemed surprised by the approach, noting that National has been widely supportive of the subsidies, even pushing for further rollouts in Auckland's second lockdown. She wasn't the only one taken aback.
I find it fascinating, given that Judith Collins comes from the background as a tax lawyer, and tax lawyers normally loathe retrospective taxation, and this is effectively a form of that being proposed.
Council of Trade Unions economist Andrea Black says it's a big call to be clawing the money back when it was completely legal for the companies to take it. And Business New Zealand CEO Kirk Hope says there isn't a need for any law changes.
Fundamentally, many of those businesses had to reshape their business. They didn't probably know what sort of rebound we might get, economic rebound we might get when they went into lockdown. And they had to make, I think, probably some very difficult decisions in order for their businesses all those businesses to survive.
He says companies which broke the rules around the wage subsidy should absolutely expect to pay it back. But he says criticism of profitable companies is short-sighted.
Let's not forget that pretty much every year the corporate tax take or the business tax take in New Zealand is around $15 billion annually. So I think what we want, it's misguided to say we don't want those businesses making money. Those subsidies were passed on to their workers, and we do want those companies to be viable and making money and reinvesting in the businesses, into their businesses, so that they can grow and employ people in the future. So anything other than that, I think, is a bit misguided.
Andrea Black says it really comes down to companies and their conscience.
The question I have is, where does this end? It's quite an interesting idea that people would retrospectively be tested to see whether they needed the money. Like the winter energy payment, for example, there are lots of superannuitants who are claiming it who don't actually need it. Could retrospective legislation come in to take that away too?
Today, Judith Collins was taking a more measured approach. She says she was caught on the hoof last night, but isn't backing down.
Well, I'd have to work out how to do it in terms of getting the votes in Parliament, and how to do it without actually unfairly affecting those people who have acted entirely correctly. But what it really is, it's a symbol of the fact that when the government set up the whole system, they just went, here's money, you go get it, with no idea that maybe some people would end up making actually a lot of money out and they'd be perfectly fine.
Jacinda Ardern isn't backing a law change. She stands by the fast rollout and says the high trust model was vital to save jobs. Nearly $500 million of wage subsidies have been repaid so far, and government spot checks are taking place into companies which took the cash. The Auditor General is also looking into the issue, but their findings won't be known until the second half of next year. For Checkpoint, Cornita Blakeperson, TNA.
It's 5:20 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Let us know what you think about that. Whether a law is required to get these companies to pay back money if they're still making profits and taking the wage subsidy, or should it be a moral or ethical issue and they should pay it back because it's the right thing to do? Or should they just keep the money? You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. The largest number of imported cases of COVID-19 in a month were reported today, but health officials say this shows the system is working. There were 12 cases in managed isolation, of whom 10 were on the same flight from India, but no new community cases for the 5th day in a row.
10 of the 12 new cases arrived from India on the 26th of September on flight AI1354 and tested positive around day 3 of their time in managed isolation. We can report that the cases were spread out throughout the plane on their flight to New Zealand, sitting between rows 14 and 41. We acknowledge that this is a high number of cases, and it reflects that most of the rest of the world continues to experience high levels of COVID-19. This also re-emphasises why we have strong border control measures in place, including day 3 and day 12 testing, to keep New Zealand and New Zealanders safe.
And Dr. Caroline McElnay, who's in for Dr. Bloomfield, says it will be a couple more days before genomic tests reveal whether the cases on the Air India flight are linked. But she says the current best guess is that the individuals were infected separately in India before catching the flight. Of today's other new cases, one arrived from the United States on the 26th of September and the other from the Philippines via Taiwan on the 23rd. Dr. McElnay says it's important for people to stay vigilant during the school holidays, and particularly if they're travelling.
Please don't let your guard down, and remember, if you become unwell while on holiday, call Healthline, your GP or nurse practitioner, who can advise you whether you should be tested. If you're advised to get a test, please do so, and don't wait until you get home to get tested. Please continue to sign into places using the NZ COVID Tracer app, or keep a record of where you've been. This is especially important when on holiday, because you may not remember all the locations that you've visited. And lastly, continue to maintain good hygiene practices, including washing and drying your hands, or use hand sanitizer if you're unable to wash your hands.
Dr. McElnay was asked if officials are working on a specific plan for what happens if there is an outbreak over the summer holidays.
The Ministry, along with the all-of-government group that is managing the response to COVID, we are constantly reviewing our plans for any outbreak, any resurgence, a range of different scenarios. That's very active work that's underway at the moment and will continue. And certainly, looking as we move into the summer months, what that would mean and what some of the challenges might be is something that we do have to consider.
That was Dr. Caroline McElnay, the Director of Public Health at the Ministry of Health, and she's standing in for Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, who's on leave. The Health Minister's told the indebted Canterbury DHB it's in an unsustainable position and needs to get back on a stable financial footing when he met face-to-face with officials and staff today. The DHB's deficit is about $180 million, and 7 of its 11-strong management team, including the CEO, resigned within weeks of each other earlier this year, amid allegations of a toxic and adversarial relationship with the board and Crown-appointed monitor and an unrealistic push for savings. Ministerial briefing documents released under the OIA show Treasury firmly believes the DHB's debt is disproportionately due to poor management and governance issues, with just some the result of underfunding over a decade. It claims there are cultural challenges within the DHB and labels the narrative around a new acute services building being at the centre of its money troubles as a big distraction, in complete contrast to concerns raised by some staff. I spoke to Minister Chris Hipkins a little earlier and asked, given the conflict in opinion opinion between Treasury and coalface hospital staff over the cause of the massive debt. Who does he believe?
Oh, look, I think there are valid perspectives all round. I think the key thing is we've got to look forward. We've got to say, look, it's not sustainable what's happening now. Clearly the DHB is outspending its means, and we've got to look at how we get out of that position, how we get them onto a sustainable footing going forward. Look, there's a lot of legacy
understand
here.
That, Minister. I do understand that, but the thing is, what caused the debt, knowing what caused the debt is important because that shapes your response, right? So Treasury accepts that the deficit is the result of underfunding over the last decade and a combination of governance and management factors. So what's the split? How much is down to that underfunding and how much is down to management and governance factors?
Well, some of the historical overspending has been down to underfunding, and what you'll see is that government's putting significant additional funding into the DHB to help address that. But again, I'll run through.
But what proportion, Minister? Do you know the proportions?
If you look at three key numbers here, Lisa, they ran a deficit of $180 million last year. Their funding has gone up by $100 million this year, and they identified about $60 million worth of savings, but the deficit only came down by $30 million. So, clearly that's not sustainable. That's a growth in spending that's well outstripping the growth in income. They can't keep doing that. They are going to have to find a way to live within their means.
So do you agree with Treasury when it says that governance and management are disproportionately responsible for that deficit?
Look, I do think that there could have been stronger expenditure monitoring and control put in place earlier on, and that might have avoided some of the difficulties that they've now got.
So when DHB clinicians and staff raise their concerns and say they think it's because of the funding model, the fact that they've had the earthquakes and the March 15 shootings, are they misinformed or are they not telling the truth?
Look, I think perhaps in Canterbury there hasn't always been a good flow of accurate information so that everybody fully understands the position, how the DHB got into that position. But that's a historical issue, and I think really...
Who's responsible for the misinformation then?
Well, we've got to get people focused on the future. I don't think it's particularly productive to go raking back over those coals. And actually, it's more important to focus on how we get the DHB.
But clearly there are still relationship issues there. There's relationship issues there. So who is responsible for the misinformation that you're talking about?
Oh, look, I think in terms of the relationship issues, there is a need to reset some relationships between the ministry, the DHB. There's a need to reset the relationship between the governance and the management of the DHB. And I think that those processes are underway now. The interim leadership that's in place at the DHB has formed a good relationship with the board, and that's a really good sign. And I think that, board and the leadership are working on resetting the relationship with the clinical leaders.
So Treasury, again, in these documents repeatedly talks about cultural issues. Does that mean that staff disagreeing with the government's position or the board, that they have cultural issues?
No, not necessarily. I think robust debate's always important in a process like this. But ultimately, you do need to have some degree of financial discipline. If every district health board in the country said, we'll just spend what we need to spend or what we think we need to spend in order to deliver the health care to our community, we won't worry about a budget, the whole health system would be in a great deal of difficulty. It's simply not sustainable to approach things in that way.
Is it good then that 7 of the 11-strong leadership team resigned, in the sense if they're not on board with the direction that you're wanting to go in? Is it good that they've gone? Were they part of the cultural problem?
Look, I didn't even get an opportunity to have a conversation with those people, so I don't think it would be fair for me to make a comment on that. Clearly, what matters now is that the DHB needs to get itself into a position where it can move forward.
So in terms of getting itself into a position where it can move forward, as you put it, are you going to look at writing off a considerable chunk of debt? National has said they would look at doing that.
Well, the government has just recently, over the last couple of weeks, agreed a capital and an equity injection for the DHB of around $180 million. That does recognise that there's some legacy issues here, that they need to have some cash to move forward with, and we're supplying that. Now, we can't keep putting equity injections into the DHB, so they do need to get themselves back onto a stable footing. But we acknowledge that in the meantime, we're going to need to provide some help as they go through this process.
Do you accept that you're taking a pretty hard line with this DHB?
No, I don't. I think that, if anything, putting an equity injection in to help them is a sign that we're willing to work alongside them.
It's just that when you read through those Treasury documents, Treasury raises concerns about the Canterbury DHB in the sense with its debt that other DHBs looking at Canterbury, their behaviour is likely driven by seeing what's going on at Canterbury. And it also says that other DHBs will be looking to the response to the mass resignations to ascertain the strength of the resolve to address the DHB's deficit. It sort of sounds like perhaps teaching Canterbury a lesson to keep the other DHBs in line. Is that what's going on here?
I wouldn't characterise it that way, but I would say that, our message to all of the DHBs is that you have to live within your means. You can't just keep clocking up big deficits without worrying about the consequences of that.
Can you see how some people might see it as what I've just said to you, that you're teaching them a lesson to keep the others in line, given the wording and the comments in this document?
No, because I don't think we're treating Canterbury any differently to the way we're treating the other DHBs, which is that we need to get all of our DHBs onto a stable financial footing. A number of DHBs are operating at a deficit. They're making good progress at getting back into the black. The government's working alongside them to make sure that happens, just as we are with Canterbury.
So, just to be clear, these senior leadership members who have resigned, clinicians that have raised concerns, people at the coalface of things down in Canterbury, they've got it wrong, have they? And Treasury has got it right when they say that this is largely a problem from governance and management within the DHB. So those clinicians, their concerns, well, they're just wrong?
I think there's a degree of talking past each other that we should acknowledge. Not everybody has the same information when they're making comment. And, frankly,
so are the clinicians ill-informed?
No, I wouldn't say that.
Well, I just can't see how there is such different, vastly different perceptions of what the problem is here. So are you picking and backing Treasury's version here?
Look, I think Treasury, the Ministry of Health have provided the government with some good, robust financial information. One of my goals in visiting today was to get the clinicians' perspective, because I do think that is a valid perspective as well. As we get the DHB back into the black, we do have to make sure that we're working carefully to ensure that patient care isn't being compromised in that process.
Okay, so to that end, are you going to stick with the Crown Monitor and the board as Treasury has suggested would be the best option, even though some people say it's an adversarial, toxic environment?
Look, I've had feedback on that. I'll consider the feedback that I've had. I do, I've had a good, robust conversations with the DHB board chair and with the Crown Monitor. I think those are ultimately decisions for after the election. The government's certainly not going to be making any changes there in the next 2 weeks.
Are you leaving the door open to bringing in a commissioner?
Look, I'm not going to speculate on that at this point.
Well, can you rule it out? Can you rule it out?
I do have confidence in the DHB board, and I do want to see the DHB board continue and succeed in the job that it's got ahead of it.
So you're ruling out a commissioner?
I didn't say that either.
So you're sitting on the fence then?
Sorry, what's that?
So are you sitting on the fence then?
No, I think I'm continuing to keep an open mind about, making sure that we're looking closely at what's happening at the DHB, always looking at what the best way of continuing to get some forward momentum is, and we'll continue to keep looking at that and continue to keep reviewing it.
One of the most important things for people listening right now will be that services are not compromised because of the savings that you may wish Canterbury DHB to make. So can you give a cast iron guarantee that no service is going to be cut or compromised because of budget constraints and savings that you want this DHB to make?
I think if you look at the fact that we've injected an extra $180 million in equity into the DHB in the last few weeks to ensure that they can get themselves back onto a sustainable footing without compromising their delivery of patient care, I think that is a sign that the government doesn't want to see cuts that compromise the quality of health care that the people of Canterbury and in fact the wider South Island, because Canterbury DHB provides services to other people in the South Island. I think that's a sign that we are committed to that.
That's not a guarantee though. You said it's a sign you're committed. So do you guarantee them there's going to be no service cuts?
Well, I think that, they've got to go through a process now of identifying how they get themselves back into the black. That's a process that will take a bit of time, and I don't think I should, get in front of that by ruling things in and out. They need
so
to
there
get their
could be
heads
service
together.
cuts then?
Well, they need to get their heads together and work out how they get themselves back into the black.
Minister, that's a pretty significant thing. So there could be service cuts, is what you're saying. They've got to come up with a plan. If that plan includes service cuts, are you saying so be it?
No, I mean, the advice that I've had is that the DHB should be able to get back into the black without making service cuts. As other DHBs around the country are doing, the government is significantly increasing the overall level of spending on DHBs. Canterbury happened to be increasing their level of spending faster than the government investment is increasing by. That's not sustainable. Now, they can get themselves back into a sustainable position. The advice that I've had is they can do that without having to make service cuts. But ultimately, the people at Canterbury DHB need to get around the table and they need to identify a plan that will get them back onto a sustainable footing.
And that was Health Minister Chris Hipkins. Coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, New Zealand Rugby Chairman Brent Impey is due to hold a press conference very soon. We'll have the latest. The Commission on Presidential Debates plans to change the format of future debates following yesterday's disastrous showdown between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And a 4-year parliamentary term got the nod from the Labour and National leaders last night. But what do voters think? We'd love your feedback. Let us know what you think about that. Should we have a 4-year term? You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz about anything you've heard so far on the program this evening. Time now, though, for the headlines with Susanna.
A public health professor says the government should consider additional control measures for countries with large outbreaks of COVID-19. There's been a surge in imported cases from India in recent weeks, with 10 new cases reported today, all from the same Air India flight on September the 26th. Otago University epidemiologist Michael Baker says the government should be considering making people from high-risk countries do pre-departure quarantine and testing. The Labour leader Jacinda Ardern is promising to begin investigations to ensure consumers aren't being ripped off by grocery and building supply prices. She says New Zealand has one of the most concentrated grocery chains in the world, and this must be scrutinised. Ms Ardern says Labour will conduct market studies for supermarkets and building supplies to check prices are fair. Labour's finance spokesperson Grant Robertson is laughing off criticism of a typo in his fiscal plan. Shortly after the plan was released this morning, Labour sent out a correction after it had mislabelled an axis on a graph. But National says Labour has made a $140 billion error. Mr Robertson says the error is not embarrassing and he insists his numbers add up. An accountant has been cleared of charges of money laundering for the Comancheros gang, but has been fined for possessing cocaine. A media personality has also had money laundering charges dropped as part of the trial of 5 people, including the gang's local chapter president, at the High Court in Auckland. The trial follows arrests made during police raids in Auckland last year. The 3 German yachties who illegally sailed into New Zealand will be escorted by police to their flight home. The trio has been in police custody in Auckland after they arrived in Opua from Tahiti last Friday in breach of border restrictions. Immigration New Zealand says they will not be escorted back to Germany, but they will remain in police custody until they board the plane. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Lisa Owen. And Nicholas Poynton's joining me now in the studio to talk business. Nicholas, I'm interested in this deal that it appears Meridian Energy was going to offer to Rio Tinto. This is obviously to get it to stay open at Tiwai Point for longer. So have they revealed exactly what they put on the table?
Yeah, they did that today at their annual shareholders meeting. But before we get to that, I thought it's probably worth doing a quick recap. So Meridian Energy, they supplied the aluminium smelters power, and it was those transmission costs to bring the power from the nearby Manapuri station to Tiwai that caused so much tension in the relationship there. And we've known for some time that Meridian tried to offer some sort of tantalising package there to stop Rio Tinto from pulling the plug. And today at its annual meeting, as I mentioned before, its chief executive told shareholders that Meridian offered Rio Tinto savings of close to $250 million to keep the smelter open for another 4 years. And this package included changes to the supply contracts, and it would deliver savings, it says, and I quote, in excess of $60 million a year for a 4-year period. And as we all know, Rio Tinto, they rejected this offer. And hearing the Meridian's chief executive speak today at the shareholders meeting, these can be, typically quite boring. The speeches are prepared way in advance, but he was audibly frustrated as he told shareholders that they really thought that this was a fair offer that would keep all parties happy. And this sort of leaves us now with, we just don't really know what's going to happen with Tiwai at the moment. All the major parties, they are promising now to keep it open, but we won't really know what happens until after the election. But at some point we do know that it is going to close, and Meridian told its shareholders today that they are doing everything they can to prepare for that, because when they do lose Tiwai, that's 13% of its total power demand gone. And so there's going to be all this excess or surplus power and water that will be unused, and the question is now is what plans they have in place to make sure or use that in the future.
If that very significant amount of savings, $60 million a year, wasn't enough, was there any mention of what they actually wanted?
No. In
order to make it happen?
And that's that's the thing. Like Rio Tinto, they've been silent over this whole ordeal. When we get in contact with them, we get statements and days after the fact. And I think it would be really interesting to know what it was that they wanted. And we just don't know.
Okay, big question mark. This is a hotel that you're going to talk about now that it didn't want to become part of the whole quarantine and isolation system, so not accepting people off flights. And is it benefiting from that, from sort of being at a distance from COVID-19?
Well, I think this is a really savvy move, because you can imagine that it required a lot of forward thinking at the time. So this is the apartment hotel franchise Quest. They own a number of hotels throughout the country, and it says its bookings have picked right up since COVID restrictions have eased. It's now up to about 5%, or it's just under 5% of pre-COVID levels. And the main reason they say that they've seen this, dramatic increase in bookings is because they're snapping up all the businesses or business people that are travelling up and down the country. They say that with all these hotels at the moment and the country's main centres being used as quarantine facilities, business people, government staff, look, they haven't been able to stay at the normal places that their businesses would typically have accounts with. So look, it's turned into a bit of a win for them. For context though, Quest in the past, the majority of its business is business people. They don't really turn to tourists, but you just have to imagine that back in March and April, when they were approached numerous times, that we've been told, to be a quarantine facility, it would have taken a lot to say no, given the fact that business travel had all but stalled at that point. COVID-19 has really changed the way that businesses work and the way that people travel. But the reason that the chief executive gave for turning this down was that, all right, they accepted that there was going to be less demand, but there's also going to be less supply. So while the business is going pretty well for the moment, the chief executive says they don't think they'll be able to get or eclipse pre-COVID levels of trading until we see the resumption of trade shows and big business conferences.
Should we take a quick trot around the market?
Yeah, absolutely. So the NZX Top 50 is up by 65.5 points to 11,812. Our own dollar is up 66.3 US cents, 92.4 Australian. We're at 51.2 British pence, in gold, it's up $6 to 1,892 US dollars an ounce.
Thanks, Nicholas. Nicholas Poynton with Business News. As part of RNZ's 2020 election coverage, we're looking at communities who are part of the country's changing face and identity. In the south of the South Island, the burgeoning Pacific population says the government funding and initiatives aren't keeping up with the needs of the growing and increasingly diverse community. Dominic Godfrey visited Otepoti, Dunedin, to have a talanoa with some of the 4,000 Pasifika who make up 3.2% of the city's population of 126,000.
There's been a flourishing Pacific community in Dunedin for a long time now, with a dozen churches in the city serving different island congregations, and sports commentators now fluent with the many Pasifika names in top-tier teams. But many in the community say the government could do more to help them thrive.
We definitely have socioeconomic challenges. We have linguistic barriers, we have health problems, we have all sorts of things that are challenging, yet our communities continue to grow and to thrive.
Jane Tawhaki is studying for a PhD in public health at Otago University, but lives in Oamaru where her children can go to school with other Tuvalu kids. Language and culture are important to Pacific identity, health and well-being. But Ms Tawhaki says the southern region's neglected when it comes to funding for Pacific health programs.
At a national level, we see funding opportunities, program opportunities are all North Island focused. And even our district health boards down here, it's hard to extrapolate health data because they don't always collect it.
Ms Tawhaki says without that information, it's hard to get an accurate picture of the need that's out there amongst the Pacific community and push for more funding. A community advocate in Otepoti, Dunedin, Melissa Lama, says there's a real lack of mental health services to cater for the city's 1,200 Pasifika tertiary students. She wants the government to ensure there are culturally appropriate healthcare options.
That's falling short on our students, and then what's happening is our associations are having to compensate for that. And so we're having to self-resource our own ways and work smartly when we shouldn't have to because we're actually here to study, but that's the reality of it.
In South Dunedin, the Pacific Trust Otago provides a range of health, education and social services. During the COVID-19 lockdown, it also started up a food bank. According to the Trust's General Manager, Finau Taonga Pe'au, they have expertise and resources, but they're competing with other providers serving the same community for a limited amount of funding.
At the moment, we are submitting collaborative applications with the Division of Sciences at the University of Otago. And unfortunately, we weren't successful with Ministry of Health with mental health initiatives that we proposed.
However, the Trust's Kenny Moiroa says people are very grateful for the level of support they've experienced during the COVID-19 lockdown. She says there are many families who've lost jobs or had full-time work hours reduced who've been able to access welfare support.
The next government needs to continue that kind of support for our Pacific family because even housing is an issue, a big issue in Dunedin because there's not many houses. Every time I go to Auckland, I see all these new houses. I haven't seen any new houses in Dunedin.
With many families struggling day to day because of the fallout from COVID-19, Jane Tawhaki says they're not so engaged with the upcoming election. She reckons there's a disconnect about what their votes can achieve at a national level.
Back in the islands, voting is very much along island lines, clan lines, familial lines, church lines. And then when we come here, we don't necessarily see our faces reflected in government.
The Pacific Trust Otago is working to lift engagement and ensure the community's enrolled to vote. It's hosting an advance voting booth to help ensure older people and shift workers can have their say. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi nei, ko Dominic Godfrey tēnei.
13 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Do get in touch about anything you hear on the program this evening. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or send us an email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. In the US, the commission that organises the country's televised presidential debates says it's now reviewing the structure of the encounters after Tuesday night's disastrous standoff between President Trump and Joe Biden. For 90 minutes, the two men clashed, with the president widely condemned for constantly interrupting his rival, and Joe Biden under pressure now from many Democrats to pull out of the remaining two meetings. With the latest, our Washington correspondent Simon Marks.
Hours after the most dyspeptic debate in the history of the televised presidential encounters here, the tectonic plates are still crashing into one another. A president unwilling to allow anyone else to get a word in edgeways, a moderator, Chris Wallace, who could not keep the train on the tracks, and Joe Biden, whose biggest mistake may simply have been showing up.
I'm not going to answer the question.
Why would you answer that
because
question?
The question is, the question is,
Justice,
the
radical
question,
left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe? Who's on your list?
Right.
Gentlemen,
I think this is so unprecedented.
He's going to pack the court. We're not going to give a list.
We have ended this segment.
That cacophony was sparked by Joe Biden's refusal to confirm whether he plans to enlarge the Supreme Court. This one arose from Donald Trump's lie about his income tax payments.
I paid millions of dollars in taxes, millions of dollars of income tax. I paid $27 million.
Show us your tax returns. I'm going to eliminate the Trump tax cuts.
But why didn't you do it over the last 25 years?
Because you weren't president. Because you weren't president screwing things up.
You were a senator. And
You're
by
the
way,
worst
you were
president America has ever had.
In the cold light of day, Mr. Biden conceded the debate was a national embarrassment and said he might seek a change in the rules in a bid to avoid a repeat.
I just hope there's a way in which the debate commission can control the ability of us to answer the question without interruption. My hope is that they're able to literally say the question gets asked of Trump. He has a microphone. He has 2 minutes to answer the question. No one else has a microphone. And then I don't know what the actual rules are going to be, literally. But that's what seemed to me to make some sense.
At the White House, President Trump falsely suggested the polls show he won the debate, and he accused Joe Biden of looking for a reason to avoid the next two.
By every measure, we won the debate easily last night. I think he was very weak. He looked weak. He was whining. No, I don't mind debating him. I hear he wants to get out of the debates. I don't know. That's up to him.
In fact, Mr. Biden says he's looking forward to them, which may only raise fresh questions about his judgment. The most shocking moment on Tuesday night came when the president was challenged to disavow a neo-fascist group of militarized vigilantes, the Proud Boys. He didn't do it.
Sure, are you prepared to specifically do it? I'm willing to do anything. I want to see peace.
Then do it, sir. Say it. Do it. Say it.
Do you want to call them? What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
who would
right
you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud Boys. Stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what. Somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left.
The president, who has already threatened that he may not honour the peaceful transfer of power here, seemed to be putting white supremacist vigilantes on standby for future deployment. At the White House on Wednesday, he tried to walk it back.
I don't know who the Proud Boys are. I mean, you'll have to give me a definition because I really don't know who they are. I can only say they have to stand down, let law enforcement do their work. As people see how bad this radical liberal Democrat movement is and how weak, the law enforcement's going to come back stronger and stronger. But again, I don't know who Proud Boys are.
But they certainly know who the president is, and they've changed their logo to incorporate his instruction to stand back and stand by. The Commission on Presidential Debates, a starchy group of political veterans, seems stung by what took place on Tuesday. A statement said it's considering additional structure to ensure a more orderly discussion of the issues. Any changes to the rules will have to be agreed by both campaigns, of course, so it is entirely possible that we may have seen the one and only debate of this woeful election cycle. For Checkpoint, I'm Simon Marks in Washington.
President Trump is running damage control, claiming he doesn't know anything about the fringe right-wing group, the Proud Boys. During the fiery debate yesterday, Mr. Trump, as you heard, refused to condemn white supremacy and instead told the group to stand back and stand by. The Democratic challenger, Joe Biden, says the president refuses to disavow white supremacists. CNN's Jim Acosta reports.
After turning the first debate of the 2020 campaign into a dumpster fire, President Trump is trying to put out the flames before they torch his re-election chances. The president is insisting he's not familiar with the right-wing group, the Proud Boys, the same organization he declined to criticize when he refused to condemn white supremacy at the debate.
I don't know who the Proud Boys are. They have to stand down, let law enforcement do their work.
The president gave the group a pass in a moment that even had fellow Republicans cringing.
You want to call them? What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
who would
white
you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud Boys. Stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what. Somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left, because this is not a right-wing problem.
How do you like the Proud Boys now?
Members of the Proud Boys, a violent group embracing racist views, celebrated Mr. Trump's comments, posting images on social media stating they are standing by. GOP senators quickly called on Mr. Trump to clarify his remarks.
I think he misspoke in response to Chris Wallace's comment. He was asking Chris what he wanted to say. I think he misspoke. I think he should correct it. If he doesn't correct it, I guess he didn't misspeak.
Senator, should the president have condemned white supremacists last night at the debate?
Of course.
The president's decision to clean up his comments came after White House officials maintained Mr. Trump's response was perfectly fine.
Because they're celebrating it, the group. I don't think that there's anything to clarify here.
Still, one Trump campaign advisor was outraged, telling CNN, F the Proud Boys. There, I said it, not that hard. The president is also claiming he's always denounced white supremacy, despite his history of equivocating over neo-Nazi violence in Charlottesville.
I've always denounced any form of any of that.
Democrat Joe Biden's message on the subject was more succinct.
My message to the Proud Boys and every other white supremacist group is cease and desist.
And that report was from CNN's Jim Acosta. To the UK now, where the Prime Minister says the country's at a critical point in the battle against coronavirus. Boris Johnson's warning he won't hesitate to put further measures into place if necessary. This comes as infection rates continue to soar, with latest figures showing more than 7,000 new cases and another 71 deaths. The BBC's Laura Koonsberg reports.
This is Sito. Coronavirus has changed her and her family's life. She and her husband both had the disease. His lungs are still scarred, and things are different now.
My husband was one of those people who, when COVID first came on the scene, he was a believer that it wasn't going to affect him. It wasn't going to touch him. He was under 45. He was fit and healthy, and it wasn't going to affect him. My husband nearly died, and it's really real. We found ourselves being more isolated at home.
And in that melee, Boris Johnson. Coronavirus has changed his life and his leadership too. Cases are rising again, political pressure mounting, winter on the way.
No matter how impatient we may be, how fed up we may become, there is only one way of doing this, and that's by showing a collective forbearance, common sense and willingness to make sacrifices for the safety of others.
He can't say enough. He doesn't want another national lockdown, but it's plain it could yet happen.
If the evidence requires it, we will not hesitate to take further measures that would, I'm afraid, be more costly than the ones we put into effect now.
We can see today that the limits are already in place on millions of people have not stopped the spread, and you even had to apologise for failing to explain the rules properly. How can people have confidence in your government's approach, and can you give people your honest assessment? How high is the chance of more restrictions coming in for everyone, everywhere?
The answer is, I'm afraid, entirely dependent on how effective we are now collectively in driving down the virus. And we know we can do it because we did it before. Our success will have to be judged, I'm afraid, in the days and weeks ahead.
We've got a long winter ahead of us and a lot could happen over that time. So I think to predict forward from here would be a big mistake.
Numbers of cases are going up, hospitalisations are going up, ICUs going up, and unfortunately, very sadly, so are deaths. And that means that this is headed in the wrong direction. There's no cause for complacency here at all.
And the disease has changed the balance between ministers and MPs too. At the start of the epidemic, the Tories seemed the masters of Parliament. Now, ministers have given ground to backbenchers who'll have more of a say over extra restrictions being rushed through. But not before a serious ticking off from the Speaker.
A total disregard for the House.
For cutting MPs who represent all of us out of the process.
I now look to the government to rebuild the trust with this House and not treat it with the contempt that it has shown.
And just as the Tory backbenches are proving less reliable than the government might hope, the opposition too is sharpening their attacks.
The government side of the bargain here is to have a very clear strategy for keeping that infection rate down, and we don't see that strategy. Very clear communications, and the byword for this week has been yet again confusion.
But even
And that was Laura Koonsberg reporting there. Time for some of your feedback before we go to the 6 o'clock news on whether we should have a 4-year term for government. This listener says voters have already rejected that in 2 referendums, a 4-year term. Politicians should certainly ask a third time before doing anything that might still be unwanted by their employers. One other person says 4 terms, yes, if Labour is in government, 1 year if it's national. And Helen says no to a 4-term without a significant improvement in constitutional checks and balances to protect our democracy. And any change should be done via referendum like MMP, says Helen, not by Parliament without reference to the electorate. But Ken says 4 yearly elections should be considered. Give us a longer spell between BS fests, says Ken. Thanks for your feedback, Ken. Another listener says 100% 4 years. How else do we implement systemic lasting change? A lot of others also agreeing, saying 4 years, because governments need more time to plan and put strategy in place, is what Gary says. On the subject of Canterbury's DHB, Jan's got in touch saying anyone waiting for an operation in Canterbury and hearing Chris Hipkins' fatuous talk won't be voting Labour. I'm waiting for a hip replacement in Christchurch, and if Canterbury Health Board has to cut back any further, they may as well shut up shop and go home. Gary says hospitals and health boards must not be run as businesses. They must concentrate on the care for the patients instead of making profits and losses. Now, coming up after 6 o'clock, we're expecting to hear from New Zealand Rugby.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leātawa tēnei. A public health professor says travellers from countries with large COVID-19 outbreaks should be subject to stricter controls. There has been a surge in imported cases from India in recent weeks, with 10 new cases reported today, all from the same Air India flight on September the 26th. More than 6 million COVID cases have been reported in India. Otago University epidemiologist Michael Baker says the government could ultimately save money by paying for people from high-risk countries to do pre-departure quarantine and testing.
If we could reduce the number of people who are infected with this virus entering or even getting on a flight to New Zealand by a large proportion, which I think you could do with that approach, that would probably be a very good use of resources.
Professor Baker says these measures would be in addition to the current border and testing rules. Labour's finance spokesperson Grant Robertson is laughing off criticism of a typo in his fiscal plan. Shortly after the plan was released this morning, Labour sent out a correction after it had mislabelled an axis on a graph. But National says Labour has made a $140 billion error. Mr Robertson says the error is not embarrassing, and he insists his numbers add up. National's finance spokesperson Paul Goldsmith says the mistake is embarrassing given the past week.
Yes, but you would have thought Grant Robinson has spent the last 10 days jumping up and down about figures, and he still managed to get his own wrong.
Paul Goldsmith says the overall plan lacks substance. The Labour Party is promising market studies to check the price of groceries and building supplies is fair. Party leader Jacinda Ardern says New Zealand has one of the most concentrated grocery chains in the world and this must be scrutinised. She says consumers had a lot of feedback, particularly about the cost of food during the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Ms Ardern says Labour will conduct market studies for supermarkets and building supplies to check consumers are getting fair prices. The Health Minister says the Canterbury District Health Board is in an unsustainable position and needs to get back in the black. The DHB has a deficit of $180 million and 7 of its 11 management team resigned within weeks of each other earlier this year. Documents released by Treasury show it believes the DHB's debt is due to poor management and underfunding over a decade. Chris Hipkins, who meet with staff today, says he has confidence in the DHB's board but doesn't rule out appointing a commissioner.
The advice that I've had is that the DHB should be able to get back into the black without making service cuts, as other DHBs around the country are doing. The government is significantly increasing the overall level of spending on DHBs. Canterbury happened to be increasing their level of spending faster than the government investment is increasing by. That's not sustainable.
Health Minister Chris Hipkins. A law professor says Māori representation would be more important than ever if New Zealand moved to a 4-year parliamentary term. The idea of government sitting for 4 years rather than the current 3 got the nod from both major party leaders last night in News Hub debate. Māori law professor Jacinta Ruru is supportive of the idea, but is concerned about accountability when it comes to honouring the Treaty of Waitangi.
I do worry, though, for example, if we don't have a strong Māori voice in Parliament, what is that going to mean for us as a country? And that speaks probably more to some of the issues in our constitutional makeup of Aotearoa New Zealand.
Jacinta Ruru, a law professor of Ngāti Raukawa and Ngāti Ranginui iwi. New Zealand First has released 40 pages of policy this afternoon, hours before Leader Winston Peters appears in a debate. Until now, the party has released very little in the way of policies. Its policy vision statement is framed around the COVID-19 recovery and outlines its view on the state of the economy, the public service, immigration and tax. The Vatican has rejected a meeting between Pope Francis and the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Mr Pompeo is in Rome attending a symposium on religious freedoms. Our correspondent Jagruti Dave has more.
At the symposium, Mike Pompeo gave a speech where he criticised China's record on religious freedoms. His visit comes as the Vatican is in discussions to renew a provisional deal with China regarding the appointment of bishops. The Secretary of State had also written an article where he said the Vatican endangers its moral authority should it renew the deal. One top Vatican diplomat told an Italian news agency Pompeo's criticisms were an attempt to involve the Pope in US politics, and that was why he had declined a meeting.
Jagruti Dave reporting. It's 5 minutes past 6. New Zealand Rugby is set to confirm Super Rugby Aotearoa will return in 2021 with the 5 current New Zealand sides. According to the New Zealand Herald, NZR has delayed the inclusion of the 6th team in the competition until 2022. Meanwhile, Sport Minister Grant Robertson says the All Blacks are continuing to look for ways to get the team home for Christmas. The Rugby Championship in Australia would see the All Blacks play their final match on December 12th before heading into 14 days quarantine on their return. The schedule has been controversial, with New Zealand Rugby saying they were blindsided by news of the game. Robertson says the team will have to complete quarantine whatever happens.
Look, New Zealand Rugby is looking at a whole range of options for how they can not have the All Blacks in quarantine during Christmas. We've been very clear with them that everyone coming back into New Zealand will be treated the same, and so it will be 14 days.
Sports Minister Grant Robertson. Dutch tennis player Kiki Bertens has been accused by her opponent of exaggerating an injury in her 3-hour second round win at the French Open. The 5th seed left the court in a wheelchair, screaming in pain after saving a match point near the end of her 7-6, 3-6, 9-7 win over Italy's Sara Errani. Bertens says she was cramping in the left leg, right foot and both hands in the closing stages of the match and needed 45 minutes of intense massage to recover. Los Angeles Lakers basketball player Anthony Davis scored 34 points and grabbed 9 rebounds as the Lakers won 116-98 over the Miami Heat in Game 1 of the NBA Finals. That's the news.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
There was so much back and forth, interjecting, really passionate debate happening, and at times almost yelling over each other to get their answers in.
Lately with me, Karen Hay, is your late night eye on the latest headlines and the people who are making them.
I think it was a little bit better than Trump versus Biden. That is an incredibly low bar to clear.
Up to date if you're up late. Lately with Karen Hay every weeknight from 10 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland and Waikato fine but isolated showers, clearing tomorrow evening. Coromandel, Bay of Plenty, Taupo, Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, cloudy periods, isolated showers in Bay of Plenty and about the ranges elsewhere. Waitomo to Manawatu, including Taumaranui, Taihape, Wairarapa, Nelson and Marlborough. Fine apart from a few areas of cloud, and again tomorrow. Horowhenua to Wellington, fine today, cloudy periods tomorrow with patchy drizzle. Bulla to Fiordland and Stewart Island, cloud increasing, showers developing south of Hokitika tonight, spreading everywhere tomorrow, then turning to rain from the south with heavy falls possible. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, excluding Stewart Island, mostly fine today, high cloud developing tomorrow, with a few spots of rain in Otago and Southland. Gale nor'westerlies in exposed places tomorrow. Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. RNZ National, it's 8 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora anō. If you're just joining us, New Zealand Rugby Chairman Brent Impey is holding a Zoom press conference in a few minutes, at about 6:15 we think. We have reporters across it and we will bring you the latest. But first, a 4-year parliamentary term got the nod from both major party leaders last night. But what do voters think? The concept has been put to the public twice before, in 1990 and 1967, and got heavily voted down both times. Our reporter Rachel Thomas set out to see if thinking had changed.
Should we have 4-year terms for governments instead of 3? Judith Collins?
Yes.
4-year terms you support?
Gosh, we might be able to do that.
Yeah, it's great. Okay,
right,
after this you guys can talk.
We don't want to see you for 4 years.
A light and hearty moment of agreement between Jacinda Ardern and Judith Collins in last night's News Hub Leaders debate. The Labour and National Party leaders would like to see governments stay in power for 4 years rather than the current 3. But on Wellington's waterfront, the voting public was not so enthusiastic.
I quite like that, we get to choose after 3 years, and if we want to vote out or vote in.
3 years is good enough. 4 years is a long time, and change should be constant. That's the nature, I guess.
You can do a lot in a year. Just that extra year may add, more damage.
New Zealand has one of the shortest parliamentary terms in the world. Of 190 countries with parliaments, 103 have 5-year terms, 74 have 4-year terms, and just 9 governments are in power for 3 years before an election is held. Some voters felt we should join the majority, saying it would mean more time to get things done between elections.
Quite a good idea, I think.
Yeah, well, it'll save a bit of money, I suppose. Jacinda likes that idea. I think Judith does too.
I think it would be good, yeah, because that gives them time to actually get stuff done, because they're just trying to probably tidy up the last leaders' policies.
I think 3 years is too short. It doesn't give the opposition chance to organise, to regroup, and I think it's sort of tipped in the favour of the incumbent government to get another term.
Everyone RNZ asked said there should be a referendum on the concept. A report from Victoria University's Governance and Policy Institute last year recommended New Zealand move to 4-year terms, saying it would help politicians plan for the future. One of its authors, law professor Jonathan Boston, says the longer process creates more opportunities for major reform. But he says it's important the issue be put to the public rather than being steamrolled through Parliament.
And the fact that we've had referenda in the past on this issue, both of which were defeated, I might say, would imply that we should have a referendum if we were to change the term of Parliament.
Professor Jonathan Boston says realistically it would be at least 2026 before we could see a 4-year parliamentary term. Māori law professor Jacinta Rudu is supportive of the idea, but she has some concerns about representation and compliance with the Treaty of Waitangi.
For example, if we don't have our Māori party there in Parliament in the next round, or we don't have a strong Māori voice in Parliament, what is that going to mean for us as a country? And that speaks probably more to some of the issues in our constitutional makeup of Aotearoa in New Zealand.
RNZ asked all sitting party leaders whether they support 4-year terms. ACT leader David Seymour supported both 4-year terms and a referendum on the issue. New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters was in favour, and Green Party co-leader Marama Davison says the idea is worth considering, though both of them did not support holding a referendum. Local Government New Zealand is already pushing for referendum for local councils and mayors to move to 4-year terms, saying 3 years is not enough time to implement long-term plans. For Checkpoint, Rachel Thomas.
The Pike River recovery operation is nearing another milestone, with workers now almost 2 kilometres into the mine drift. Next month will mark 10 years since the mining disaster on the west coast, which killed 29 men. The Pike River Recovery Agency held a media briefing in Christchurch this afternoon to provide an update on its progress. Its Chief Operating Officer, Dingy Pattinson, says the recovery is on track, despite COVID setbacks, thanks to operational changes.
We've gone from 50 minutes to put a roof bolt in down to 14 or 15, But the biggest change really was the hours of work for the workforce, We wanted to move to longer hours to try and get some more hours in the tunnel, because every hour we get in the tunnel gets us closer to the end line. So we wanted to move from 80 hours a fortnight to 90 hours a fortnight.
And that was Pike River Recovery Agency Chief Operating Officer Dingy Pattinson. Also at the briefing was our reporter Anand Zaki, who joins us from Christchurch. Good evening, Anand. Now, we heard there about the impact of COVID on the recovery. What else did they have to say about that?
Yeah, good evening, Lisa. Well, of course, there's been the 2-month delay due to COVID, which has impacted everything we know. This has forced them to make operational changes, as Pattinson alluded to there, and here are a couple of the big ones. So one is around how they installed the roof bolts, which saved a considerable amount of time. And it went from 50 minutes to install a roof bolt to about 15 minutes, which of course makes a huge difference and saves a lot of time. There's also been an increase in working hours from 80 hours a fortnight to 90 hours a fortnight. Now, we've been told this was done in consultation with workers and done with risk assessments, so we have been assured that it is being done without compromising safety.
So have any human remains been found in the mine?
No remains have been found yet, but interestingly, speaking to Dingy Pattinson earlier, it remains possible that remains could be found due to the sheer power of the explosions. We've been told to remember that there were 4 very powerful explosions, which would have caused a lot of damage inside the mine. But if they do find any remains, it is unlikely that the public will be informed straight away. That's because there is a process around that involving notifying the families, the police and the coroner. So if any remains are found, don't expect to find out immediately.
And speaking of families there, Anand, were any of them present at the briefing today?
No, this was a briefing just for the media. No families were present inside the room. There were no new announcements or anything like that by the agency. This was simply updating the public on how the recovery is progressing and where they are at.
Okay, so given that, where are the recovery workers now and what's next?
So they're currently in an area known as Pit Bottom and Stone, which is around 1,900 metres inside the drift. They have passed the loader that was being operated by explosion survivor Daniel Rockhouse. He was in the loader at the time of the first blast. The agency says the next milestone is to reach the 2-kilometre mark and go past the Hawera fault. And the final stage is reaching the foam plug, which separates the fresh air atmosphere in the drift and the nitrogen and methane atmosphere in the mine workings. So workers will continue through the plug and reach the rockfall inside the mine, which is the final point workers will go to before turning back around. Dingy Pattinson says the agency expects to finish up and exit the mine by the end of December, and then hand over the mine to the Department of Conservation in March next year. So the focus next year will, of course, be on the forensic results from everything that will be recovered from the mine, and we don't know how long that analysis will take. Lisa?
Thanks for the update, Anand. That's Anand Zaki just updating us on the Pike River recovery there. He was at the briefing in Christchurch today. There's been a big shift in the trial involving the Comancheros in Auckland. A media personality and an accountant accused of money laundering for the gang were cleared of the charges today, with one copping a fine for drug possession instead. They're among 5 people originally facing a raft of money laundering, drug possession and organised crime charges after a series of police raids across the city last April. Katie Todd was in court.
It's 3.5 weeks since the start of the trial of the Comanchero gang's local chapter president Pasilika Naufahu and 4 others in the High Court at Auckland. The jury has heard bugged phone calls, allegedly including coded conversations about large sums of money, and it's heard details of an attempted drug deal on the side of the road in the suburb of Takanini. The defence case was expected to start this week, but this morning Justice Graham Lang told jurors that was no longer happening, and insufficient evidence had whittled 11 charges down to 4 and 5 defendants down to 3.
Well, members of the jury, short and sweet, but that concludes the evidence you're going to hear. None of the defendants elected to call evidence, as indeed is their absolute right, given that they bear no onus of proof at all, as I said in my opening. There's been a big shift, as you'll understand, in the scope of the evidence you're now going to be required to consider. It's going to be reduced very considerably.
It means 2 people have now left the dock for good. One is a media personality with name suppression, who has been cleared of 2 charges of money laundering and one of participating in an organised criminal group. The other is accountant Wiwini Hakaraya, cleared of participating in an organised crime group and 3 counts of money laundering. But he admitted 2 charges of possessing a Class A drug and was sentenced this afternoon. One charge relates to a police search of his house in April last year that uncovered a bag in a Nike shoe containing 27.6 grams of cocaine. In a cupboard, they found more.
You have further charge on charge 11 that on 11 April 2019 at Auckland possessed a Class A controlled drug, particulars 18.2 grams of powder containing cocaine and methamphetamine located in a bag at your home address. How do you plead, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty was how he pleaded, and at his sentencing this afternoon, Justice Graham Lang fined the accountant $2,000. Lawyer Paul Wicks QC had asked for Hakaraya's guilty plea, good character and substantial community endeavours to be taken into account, including his work with anti-smoking and youth mentoring groups. He also assured his client had changed his ways.
Since the search in April last year, Mr Hakaraya has ceased any consumption of drugs and he is now instructing me that he no longer possesses or uses drugs and that is something that he has permanently put behind him in his life.
The trial continues for Pasilika Naufahu, who is accused of money laundering and conspiring to supply the Class B drug pseudoephedrine after a charge of conspiring to import a Class A drug was dropped. Connor Clausen is charged with conspiring to supply pseudoephedrine, and one other person with interim name suppression is charged with money laundering. The Crown is expected to deliver its closing statement tomorrow. For Checkpoint, call Katie Todd, TNA.
It is 6:20 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. The first person to be cured of HIV has died from cancer at his home in California at the age of 54. Timothy Ray Brown became known as the Berlin patient after being given a bone marrow transplant in Germany in 2007 from a donor who was naturally resistant to HIV. Here's the BBC's James Gallagher.
Timothy Ray Brown was diagnosed with HIV while living in Berlin in the 90s. Then, in 2007, he developed a type of blood cancer called acute myeloid leukemia and needed a bone marrow transplant. In a stroke of fortune, doctors found more than 250 suitable donors. They chose one with a rare genetic mutation that blocked the virus from infecting cells. Speaking in 2012, Mr. Brown said the treatment meant he no longer needed any antiretroviral drugs.
I quit taking my medication on the day that I got the transplant. After 3 months, there was no HIV anymore in my body.
Mr. Brown was effectively cured. It was a first and made headlines around the globe.
I was excited about it. but I still kind of feared that it might come back, but it didn't.
The virus was never detected again in his body, but the leukemia that led to Mr. Brown's cure returned 5 months ago. It spread to his brain and spinal cord. The International AIDS Society said it was mourning with a profoundly heavy heart. Mr. Brown's cure is too risky and expensive to use routinely. Only one other patient treated in London is known to have been cured in the same way. However, Mr. Brown inspired scientists and patients around the world. His life showed for the first time that a cure for HIV/AIDS was possible.
James Gallagher reporting there. It's been a long year for music fans starved of gigs by coronavirus lockdown measures. But if you couldn't hear your favourite stars perform their hits, would you still go if you could hear them? One venue in London is warning ticket buyers of that condition because it doesn't want to risk anyone singing along. The BBC's Jonathan Savage has this report.
Will you search through the lonely earth for me? Climb through the briar and bramble.
This is the English singer Johnny Flynn, a magical voice and one that will be heard in a completely solo performance at the Round Chapel music venue in London later this year. Solo because not even the crowd will be allowed to sing along. It's one of the measures being taken to ensure the concert is COVID safe, along with a reduced socially distanced capacity. Audiences at upcoming gigs have been told performers will only be doing their new material and rare old songs to minimise singing along. Expect no classics. Philip Lloyd is General Manager of the Round Chapel.
It's going to be much more of a concert, a recital. So there is an element of let's change the expectation of the audience in terms of what the artists are going to be presenting. We've had an amazing support from the business, and there's loads of artists who would have loved to have come along and played, but literally everyone would have known every single song, and there was no way that you were going to stop people singing.
People all over the world are being stopped from singing. Weddings and religious services are among events less melodic. Football matches have been struck by similar edicts in those few countries where at least some supporters are allowed back in. Dutch fans, unfortunately for them, just couldn't keep their mouths shut. That prompted Prime Minister Mark Rutte to order turnstiles to close once more.
De komende 3 weken is daarom alle sport zonder publiek.
For the next 3 weeks, every sport will be without an audience. So we can continue to do sport, but we will have to do it without any encouragement from the stands and without beer or hot chocolate afterwards, because the sports canteens will have to close down.
Let's end, though, with some far more obliging spectators. These fans of New Japan Pro Wrestling were being taunted last week by mean American star Jay White as they followed the rules and simply clapped the syllables of the surname of their hero, Kota Ibushi.
Give me a microphone. Give me a microphone. Is this thing on? Come on. No, that's happening. Come on, say your favourite guy's name. Ibushi. No, you see, you can't. You can't.
This guy's gotta go, Kevin. It's obnoxious. Folks follow the rules, man. And Ibushi's mid-kick. There you go. There's the start for you.
And that was the BBC's Jonathan Savage there. New Zealand rugby has been caught up in a war of words with its international counterparts over the draw for the upcoming Rugby Championship, with CEO Mark Robinson doubling down this week on his claim he never agreed to a December 12 game, which would force the All Blacks into quarantine over Christmas. But minutes of a Sanzar phone meeting held on September 17 show Mr Robinson was present and all parties agreed to an amended schedule with the December 12 game between the Wallabies and the All Blacks. The chair of Rugby Australia, Hamish McLennan, also confirmed that New Zealand Rugby agreed to the date. But this week, even Sam Cane said he was blindsided by the news, and he said his coach Ian Foster was also in the dark. So who's right here? Did New Zealand Rugby miss a trick and fail to inform its players and coach, or all are the minutes fudged? New Zealand Rugby chair Brent Brent Impey has been holding a press conference, and our reporter Alex Perrottet has been waiting patiently for news. So, Alex, what is going on?
Tēnā koe, good evening, Lisa. I've just been listening and tuning into a Zoom meeting with other media. The war of words continues. So we were wondering today, and it's been a long day waiting to see when New Zealand Rugby was going to talk. Of course, the CEO, Mark Robinson, doubled down yesterday. Now, he was saying yesterday that, no, the last board meeting was in August. We have not agreed to this, and it was a surprise. Sam Cane, as you said, backed that up. He said he even got on the phone to the coach, Ian Foster, and he was equally in the dark about this. Why is this important? Because they don't want to be coming back here and being quarantined after their December 12 scheduled game, quarantined for Christmas. They want to be back for Christmas. That's the deal. That's what they've been looking forward to. Well, Brent Impey has just been talking to media now, and he's doubling down even more. Some pretty strong words that have just been said. He said there was no board meeting. What has been leaked and has been shared in media in the last, 12 to 24 hours, which has Mark Robinson's name on it and said that he was present at that agreement that it would be December 12, not December 5. He said they're not board meetings, and it was a fundamental error. He said SANZAAR knows this. He said Rugby Australia knows this. So he's standing very, very firm.
What was a fundamental error, Alex? Is he saying that that meeting, because it wasn't a formal board meeting, it doesn't count? Is he saying Mark Robinson, in the course of this phone conversation, didn't agree to the game on the 12th?
Well, we didn't have time to put questions to him by the time that we came on air. Those questions are being asked right now, and we're hopefully going to get more of them, because he did take up a lot of his time talking about the Super Rugby comp, which is coming up, which is very interesting. Would be a story in itself if it wasn't for this tit for tat over whether we're going to have All Blacks sharing Christmas with their families or not. He's saying that, look, New Zealand Rugby's position has never changed, and he said that he does have many emails that prove that, emails going back and forth. So that's going to be interesting whether they're going to share those emails in the next few days, because all we have on paper now are those leaked minutes. As Hamish McLennan, the chair of Rugby Australia, says, they're minutes of a meeting, which it was agreed that there would be a 6-week competition, not a 5-week competition. 6-week competition, finishing on December 12, Wallabies New Zealand game there in Australia. So he's saying that we're very happy to prove it and to defend our position and our integrity, which he said has been called into question.
Before we head off, what about the players, Alex?
Well, the players, we heard from Sam Cane. He was saying that he's really looking forward, particularly for the younger players, to experience that thing of going overseas and even, as he said, enjoying a business class flight. I think people's reaction, former players in particular, you could name John Kerwin, Justin Marshall as a few examples, saying, hey, this sort of stuff happens all the time. People in other sports and other types of football experiences, playing on Christmas, not being with their family. You could interview any member of the New Zealand Warriors and they might have a very strong point of view about the sacrifices made for what is basically a very high, well-paid job. Maybe it's something they do have to suck up with, but who knows? As we're being told, options are still on the table. There could be still more chapters to go in this little saga.
And no clarification as to whether very quickly they did try to negotiate a shorter quarantine time?
We heard from the Sports Minister and Finance Minister today, Grant Robertson, and he said that, no, it's been made very clear, though, that it's 14 days. Everyone's in the same boat.
No exceptions.
That's it.
OK, we'll keep you updated on this saga. It's one that keeps rolling on, whether the All Blacks will spend Christmas in quarantine. We'll be back tomorrow. First Up's here first thing.
Back wage subsidy money from companies that went on to make a profit are being called misguided by Business New Zealand. The Labour Party is promising market studies to check the price of groceries and building supplies is fair. The Health Minister says all but 2 international airlines are using managed isolation facilities for staff on layovers. And a media personality and an accountant have been cleared of charges of money laundering for the Comancheros gang due to insufficient evidence. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Tonight on Nights, Brad Warrington continues his Kiwi hip-hop history. This evening, the purple patch that was the mid-noughties. Scribe, Fast Crew, Lady Six. Rima Bass is on the line from Sudan. And Duncan McGillivray is at the intersection of science, fact and fiction with